My brother, my cousin, my uncle, all have become victims of this pandemic. Please try to understand our mental state at this moment in our family. How can we live, and how will you inspire us to live? Can our government inspire us?
Shakuntala Banaji is a professor of media, culture, and social change at the London School of Economics, and she joins me now. Professor, Modi was widely criticized for focusing on the election while the coronavirus continued to sweep through the country, for example, holding large election rallies. Are these election results in Bengal a reflection of that?
I think we need to think very carefully about the way in which we celebrate or don't celebrate the election results in Bengal. I think there's already enough anxiety in Bengal about the amount of COVID spreading through the country that you could see this election result as just holding a line against the BJP. Nevertheless, we shouldn't be complacent in any way, because this is a government that has since 2014 come to power and stayed in power by spreading one thing and one thing only, which is simply hate. It has done so long before the COVID outbreak. It has failed signally to take its own advice, to take international health authorities' advice about limiting gatherings of more than 30 people, about social distancing. It has gone ahead with a massive number of rallies, and it's done all that in a context in which it has continued to blame minorities in the country, particularly Muslims and Christians, in a series of very damaging social media disinformation campaigns. So, for instance, if you look at the difference between the way in which the pilgrims who came for a Muslim event early in 2020 were treated and the way in which they were reprimanded nationally for having gathered together even before the lockdown was announced, and the way in which currently Hindu pilgrims are being celebrated for coming together in gatherings, you'll see that this massive double standard has really triggered this enormous catastrophe that we see unfolding in front of us. So I don't think that there is anything to be sanguine about. I want to be able to say to you, yes, it's a good thing that the BJP did not come to rule Bengal, but I want to also point out to you that the state which has done its best to contain coronavirus, which is Kerala, is a state in which not a single BJP candidate that came to power. And I think you should be talking as much about that.
You know, you mentioned the double standard on social media, and I know there was a lot of calling on social media for Modi to resign over the government's handling of the coronavirus. But on Facebook, for example, the hashtag Modi resign was censored. Is that making things worse, giving the appearance that the government is more concerned about cracking down on criticism than saving lives?
The government of India at the moment is more concerned about cracking down on criticism. It always has been. Anyone who showed any kind of dissent over the last 7 years has found themselves in extremely difficult situations. Many journalists have lost their jobs. Many journalists have lost their bylines. Many journalists have now lost their lives if they tried to contend with the ruling party. In fact, what you see is a government that is so concerned with image, a prime minister that is so concerned with image, that they have been parroting completely false information about coronavirus all the way since the first wave started. So we were told in quick succession by various arms of the government, by various different chief ministers who work for the government, that banging pots and pans, that eating various types of herbs would curb coronavirus. And it was only in January, when the government should have been making the fiercest effort to bring in oxygen supplies, to get vaccines in. And actually, at that time, they were saying they had won against COVID. So if you look at the speech that Prime Minister Modi did at Davos, he was claiming that India had somehow beaten the virus. And yet what we're now seeing, I would consider it to be a form of murder, because people are not actually dying from the virus. Many people are dying because they can't get hospital beds, because they can't get drugs which would treat their COVID symptoms, and because they can't get oxygen. That is simply unacceptable. And it is totally understandable that it would boil over into anger. Yet what do we see this week? What we have seen this week is Twitter taking down more than 100 accounts of absolutely desperate people, legitimate citizens, asking the world to intervene and to help, and showing examples, just as you're showing now on your screen, of burning funeral pyres. So really what the government wants is a complete fabricated India, which doesn't show the realities. And it wants people to bow down and simply tell the prime minister that everything is okay in the best of all possible countries. And this is not the case. Anyone who loves India now simply has to see the truth, because this virus, this epidemic, this pandemic is not going away unless we do something about the people who are not controlling it, unless we do something and send a very clear message.
Yeah, they certainly have a lot to answer for. You know, while there are oxygen shortages of hospital beds and vaccines, the Modi government has been criticized for backing a controversial $2.7 billion plan to rebuild central Delhi. What's the justification for that?
As far as I can see, there is simply no justification for spending money on something that is a vanity project at a time when people are not just desperately ill, grieving and losing relatives, but we know for a fact that many people have lost their jobs during coronavirus. Many people, hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs in the first wave, especially because of the draconian and very poorly managed lockdown. And in the second wave, we really need to have a lockdown which is supported by enormous measures to support poor people, daily wages, and people who cannot come and feed their children if there's a lockdown, who have to stop work because of the lockdown. That is the only way to cut the virus. Taking that money now from this vanity project to build a home for the prime minister, who already has one, to rearrange a beautiful part of Delhi, which is already one of the best kept in the whole country, is completely obscene. It is completely obscene, and it needs to be condemned, not just nationally. The Indian population cannot be left to cope with this on their own. I hold responsible international leaders who have given absolute mandate and legitimacy to the Indian regime over the last 7 years, because they have believed all the lies about business and about development. Everyone is responsible. And I can tell you that it will come back to bite everyone in the end, because the more this virus runs out of control in India, the more mutated variants we will see, which are not affected by the current vaccines, or which do not in any way stop at borders and boundaries. There is no way that this is just India's catastrophe. I am grieving, I am angry, as many of my co-citizens are, but equally, I am also aware that this is a global problem, and it should not just rest at the door of Indians.
Yeah, it certainly is a global problem. Thank you so much, Shakuntala Banaji, for joining us today.